Oh. I believe Freud's group psychology is as relevant as a description today as it was in his own time regarding the psychologically symbiotic bond between followers and their idealized patriarchal leaders. Freud's breakthrough in 1921 on the heels of World War I was to recognize the power of the narcissistic leader. Something happened here. Okay, here we go. For those of you who are watching this only as a recording, this is a little more than halfway through the whole talk. So you're kind of coming in after I have described what's going on with Christian nationalism as a movement in the United States.
Yes, thank you, Pam. I just want to say you complimented us earlier on our great organization, but we're not perfect.
It's easy to do.
But
so anyway, let's go back. Freud's breakthrough in 1921 on the heels of World War I was to recognize the power of a narcissistic leader and the ways in which followers unconsciously just hand over, unconsciously, that's important, their individual consciences to a demagogue who, with simplistic moral directives and all good versus evil political rhetoric, promises to restore whatever they perceive is lacking in their lives. Cat, go away. Gosh, forgetting now, lots of distractions here, sorry. The person on the lower left, by the way, for those of you who haven't been following Pennsylvania politics at all, but this is the gubernatorial candidate in Pennsylvania who did not win, thankfully, but who is an example of the most extreme Christian nationalist viewpoint, Doug Mastriano. So we talk about these figures promise to restore whatever their followers perceive as lacking in their lives. And such leaders exude a fusion of power and erotic potency that men can merge with at an unconscious psychic level, and women can admire, even desire. So how relevant is this to the rise of right-wing strongman leaders like Trump and bloody dictators all across the globe that Trump still emulates and praises, as in his praise for Putin, which has been amplified by a shockingly large number of Christian evangelicals when Putin first invaded Ukraine. This also ties in with the symbolic value of guns and a defensive hypermasculinity and the extraordinary prevalence of guns in the United States. And, you know, we just, again, another mass shooting in Michigan. At this point, according to NPR yesterday, there are now 67 mass shootings in the United States in this calendar year, and we're not even through February. This prevalence of guns in the United States is a preoccupation that is shared by a majority of white evangelical Christians who own the most guns statistically among any religious group in the United States, and who fuse the Second Amendment right to bear arms with a skewed religious fervor for personal freedom. As the Outback restaurant motto has it, no rules, just rights. And yes, beginning with Sarah Palin's appearance on the national political scene, women have also begun to emulate this muscular masculinist style. Love, said Freud, puts a check on narcissism, and as such is crucial to civilization. But the narcissistic leader loves only himself and exploits the love and devotion of his followers only and always for his own benefit, as he sees it, according to his whims. So a high conformity group with a highly manipulative leader can exploit individuals who feel wounded, whether by repressed childhood traumas or by envy, economic fears, and group resentments, or by a changing societal landscape that threatens their cherished notions of tradition and even identity. Narcissistic leaders thrive on amplifying perceived threats and providing simplistic solutions. Appeals to nostalgia for a better, earlier time, which is usually fictional and only benefiting one ethnic group, can be wrapped in nationalism as patriotism rather than pure ethnocentrism. So Trump's motto, "Make America Great Again," and Doug Mastriano's appeal to restore Pennsylvania to the shining beacon of freedom and hope it once was, made this strong appeal to a glorious past that never was glorious for scores of women, persons of color, and Native Americans. And the narcissistic leader can heighten this appeal by framing it all in terms of a religious cause. Mastriano's motto was "Walk as free people," a distorted quote attributed to the Gospel of John. Such religious appeals invoke that battle of good versus evil, in which fear is easily mobilized into hate. So, taking all of this into consideration, how can we talk across the extreme religious and political divide that has emerged from these trends in white right-wing Christian nationalism? Is it even possible? And if so, how? And if not, what do we do instead? The purpose of this part of my book, as in the subtitle, is by no means to create a false peace forged by mainstream appeals to unity, which gloss over the deadly realities of racism and other forms of oppression and can silence movements for justice and social change. So we're not saying, as the Hebrew prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel both warned, crying peace, peace where there is no peace. The powers of backlash, of white supremacy, and patriarchy depend on lies to keep unjust systems in place. And so this goes to the heart of the question, how can I talk across the rift that's happened in my family, my church, my community, because we've come to believe diametrically opposing ideas about faith, health, the economy, climate change, and politics. After spending some time immersed in Christian nationalist settings for my research, I came to agree with the assessment of many that Christian nationalists truly live in an alternate reality. Is honest, open conversation even possible? Several psychologists who've studied this phenomenon have stated that once people have gone down the rabbit hole of misinformation and conspiracy theories, there can be no convincing them of the truth. I disagree. As a therapist, I believe in talk under the right conditions. Rather than throwing in the towel, I recommend a triage approach to discern if and when fruitful conversation might be possible and when it should not be attempted. As psychologist Bandy Lee has recommended, when dialogue is not possible, engagement in education and activism are the best way to channel our own frustration and outrage. When it comes to a firmly entrenched Christian nationalist, we have to remember that we are trying to talk not only with an individual, but to engage with their favorite news network, an ever self-reinforcing bubble of opinion fed to them on social media, through algorithms, sifting through their clicks and likes, and the hundreds or even thousands of members of their church, where they just praised Jesus and asked him to save the United States while listening to heart-thumping rock music and indoctrinating sermons. We're trying to talk with QAnon. So argumentation will not work, period. We do need to walk away also whenever we perceive that to continue in such a one-sided dialogue will either violate our own sense of personal integrity, continuing to engage in what we consider to be outright hate speech, or causing harm to ourselves because we're being subjected to verbal violence. When fruitful conversation may be possible, how do we put a toe in the water? How do we know? There might be a yellow light. Proceed with caution when we sense some openness, as in the case of a soft Christian nationalist who is not wholly convinced by right-wing rhetoric, and where mutual liking and trust are already established. For example, a coworker, a neighbor, a skeptical family member, or a friendly acquaintance. The only way into such a conversation is to show respect and to listen, not to pounce on an error in their thinking or immediately try to enlighten or heal them. I mean, who wants to be enlightened or healed by somebody else? And I really appreciated at the very beginning when you shared your norms for your group, the way that you put very much the same kind of listening practices in place for your group. So you already know how to do this. To try to understand with as much empathy as we can muster, what must it be like to be this person and to inhabit their life with its various challenges and stresses, noticing that empathy, trying to understand where they're coming from, is not the same thing as sympathy. It's being able to step into the other's shoes, at least to some meaningful degree, to understand where they're coming from, but by no means does it have to mean agreement. Now, moving on to a green light is still always tentative. When it appears that there is some real openness to re-examine convictions, but remember, it can turn yellow or even red at a moment's notice. I've outlined in my chapter a number of recommendations on how to engage in such conversation from my experience as a psychotherapist and a teacher of spiritual care. And there are many, and your norms actually are a very good example of such a compilation. First and foremost is that building and maintaining relationship comes first. By finding common ground, including shared values. You can't assume that someone who subscribes to Christian nationalism doesn't share still some of your core values about the importance of healing and care, sanctity of life, and all kinds of things that you may find in common. Practicing respect and kindness. Much of what I advocate is being non-directive, making I statements rather than universal truth claims. So instead of saying, Christian nationalism is just bogus and it's a bucket of lies, you might want to say, I have found myself troubled by some of the things that I've heard Christian nationalists say. Following longtime anti-racist feminist activist Loretta Ross, assuming goodwill until proven otherwise, and when confronting, engaging in a process she terms calling in rather than publicly and self-righteously calling out the person who has said or done something you find offensive. So what Loretta is talking about here is you don't have to humiliate the person publicly if they have said something that perhaps unintentionally they didn't even realize was offensive, but you know that it is, at least to give the benefit of the doubt the first time around, and to have a conversation with them based on respect and empathy, as opposed to quite frankly doing virtue signaling, trying to prove that you're more woke than they are because you caught their error. She reserves calling out for addressing larger systems, which she calls calling up the abuses of institutions and structures of power. And I was asked to do this for another group not too long ago. How does all of this fit in with doing legislative advocacy and nonviolent protest? And I would say you can pretty much transfer a lot of these same principles to your political work. Build a relationship with your representatives over time. So show concern and a willingness to listen. Again, use I statements and know your facts, have evidence to present. Try to meet in person. Handwritten letters also still matter. No slacktivism, which is just putting your name on an online petition and moving on. Show that there's a real person behind whatever it is that you're trying to communicate. Be persistent like the widow and the unjust judge in Luke 18. Just keep knocking on that door. Be patient and choose your timing. And don't let a defeat you. And then stay active in the public square and in the halls of government. And so planning actions that are well-timed to current events. Plan events that will attract media attention. Specific is better than generic. Gandhi talked about making salt, which was prohibited. And so there was a protest where people made salt because they needed to make salt. A die-in around gun violence is, for example, a specific kind of action that shows the horror of what's happening statistically and the scope of the problem. So specific is better than a whole big generic protest about 100 different things. Include an element of humor, inventiveness, or something eye-catching. Remain nonviolent and train participants for any nonviolent civil disobedience. One thing that's really concerned me, and I've seen this with students in the recent BLM demonstrations, is that in my generation, and many of us in this meeting tonight, if we did civil disobedience, we were trained what to do and how to do it. And we understood what we were doing and that we needed to accept the consequences of what we were doing, and that was a part of the entire process. But there are a lot of people now who go into these situations and they do civil disobedience without having any protections in place, without being necessarily tied to a community that can support them in it, and all kinds of ways in which it can be documented, which nowadays it's very good to record any negative interactions that you might have on a cell phone so that you have proof of what happened later if you do end up in court. So those are just some of my recommendations for when you're doing actual activism. I want to say too, going back to my psychoanalytic side for a moment, that being willing to listen and speak about the whole truth of what is happening in America today, and I would also say, talking about the whole truth of the history of the founding of the United States, is finally a form of combating psychological splitting, recognizing and resisting the very human unconscious temptation to split everything into a Manichaean cosmic battle of good versus evil, which is what conspiracy theorists thrive on. This requires stamina. It takes courage to consciously weigh both the good and bad of a relationship and hold them together, regarding the other person with both mercy and justice. Violence, whether physical or verbal, is never acceptable, but dialogue always has at least the potential to be constructive. Finally, one thing honest dialogue then requires is to do our own inner work of healing the split between our own desired purity and the mostly disavowed evil within ourselves, and to withdraw our worst projections that we've placed on another person, demonizing them, before we can enter into genuine dialogue. We need to stop demonizing the other person. Now, I'll acknowledge this is tricky because Christian nationalism, white supremacy, and misogyny are truly reprehensible. And that is not just our fantasy or a neurotic projection. But if we can hold the badness of a conversation partner's beliefs together with a belief in the potential for basic human goodness, as we are made in the image and likeness of God, and the potential for rationality, as Freud said, where id was, ego might be, then we not only may have the chance to exercise the skill of empathic listening, we may also finally be heard. Thank you for your attention. Many of you probably recognize this as the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and this was a Black Lives Matter vigil that started on the steps of the cathedral.
Again, for those who haven't had a chance to read Pam's book, there's so much more there even than she was able to present tonight. So it's highly, highly recommended. Pam, first of all, thank you. That was amazing. We have about a half an hour now before we close up shop at 9 o'clock. And I'm going to be inviting folks to ask their questions. So if you do have a question or a comment or a story that you want to tell, you can use the little control at the bottom of your Zoom screen to raise your hand. You can physically raise your hand if you can't figure out how to use the button. And you could also write a comment or a question in chat. And Ginny, I'm going to ask you, Ginny Lachlan from our organizing committee, she's going to be monitoring the chat. And Ginny, if you could also keep an eye on the screens and let us know if someone has raised their hand. If you, Ginny, could kind of moderate the next half hour, I have some questions that I'm going to sort of start the dialogue with Pam. But Ginny, if you would just kind of jump in when you have anything that someone would like to ask to be part of the conversation, that would be great. So Pam, again, thank you. And I'd like to ask a couple of questions that occurred to me while I was reading your book and also while listening to you this evening. One thing that I'd like to probe a little bit, and I think you've partially answered this question, but it's something that still sort of troubles me as I've thought a lot about this issue of Christian nationalism. So we know there are people and groups that actually openly espouse Christian nationalism. They even use that term. I've seen Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example,
the new
say,
T-shirt,
yeah, she's
proud
one,
Christian nationalist. Yeah,
that's right, member of Congress. So she makes no bones about the fact that she considers herself a Christian nationalist. Now, you mentioned the survey statistics, and I even started my introduction of you by talking about some of the most recent survey statistics, which are very alarming because they do suggest that large fractions of Americans, especially white Americans and self-proclaimed Christian Americans, believe some tenets of Christian nationalism. But as I read your book, one of the things that I was grappling with was the fact that you have people like Marjorie Taylor Greene who openly espouse Christian nationalism. And then you have some of the leaders that you talked about in the book who have, for example, advocated really hair-raising things like capital punishment, the death penalty for homosexuals, or the death penalty for women who are unchaste. Okay, so that's really, really extreme stuff. Now, then by contrast, when we look at the surveys that are cited to illustrate Christian nationalism, some of the beliefs there sound almost harmless, don't they, right? And you kind of mentioned this in your presentation, like, for example, US laws should be based on Christian values. And as you mentioned, the civil rights movement, in a sense, was all about that, although the Christian values there were about forgiveness, love, inclusion, acceptance, all those kinds of Christian values. So how do we, it does seem as though there's a spectrum here, isn't there, of people who are, I think of, relatives and family members of mine who are nostalgic for what they view as the good old days, and say, well, things were better at one time. And they have kind of a vague set of beliefs around that, which may often lead them, to maybe vote the opposite way than I would vote. And maybe they feel sort of upset when they see a trans person on television. And maybe the Black Lives Matter protests kind of bothered them, especially when a couple of people did get violent. That kind of thing, versus people who are advocating the death penalty for homosexuals. So there's this range, and I wonder, is it helpful? I guess I wonder about how we apply a term like Christian nationalism so that we capture that nuance, so that we recognize what's truly alarming and scary about this movement, while also not tarring, with that brush, lots of people who may or may not quite fit into that. And forgive me, maybe I may not have expressed the question clearly enough, but I think, Pam, you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Well, I do think it's a spectrum, and both of the big surveys now that have been published, or the research from surveys, these are based on pre-existing massive surveys. They are databases of information. The Baylor Religion Study, and then there's one other one that Whitehead and Perry use. And so the questions were preset. And so sociologists go to these databases and they choose the sort of the packets of questions that are getting at what they want to know. So those questions didn't necessarily specifically address, do you want the death penalty for LGBTQ persons? So what McDaniel and what Whitehead and Perry have done is to try to make a differentiation between those who are the really hardcore, what I call true believers, and those who are more leaning toward, and then they make the same distinction on the other end, which is leaning away and completely rejecting. So the hardcore folks, probably there's more nuance even within each of those groups, right? And that there can be very right-wing political Christians
Mhm.
who would agree with all of those statements that were on the survey,
Mhm.
but who are not QAnon believers and are not necessarily at the far end of the conspiracy theories. And
Okay.
I don't know that we have enough nuance in the existing statistical studies that we have.
Okay.
The qualitative studies that we have get at a little bit more of kind of what are some of the themes, the tropes that come up now.
Yeah.
But the other thing just to realize is that going back 30 years by some accounts, and even much, much longer than that, if you think about other historical trends, this is not a new phenomenon, and it shapeshifts and it takes on different rhetoric, and sometimes borrows old rhetoric. So for example, the Nazi rhetoric that gets embedded in some of the far right movement. And there definitely was a cynical alignment that happened about 30 years ago during the Reagan administration and carried on in the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, where right-wing evangelical church leaders and right-wing political operatives actually came together and decided that they could make an alliance. And this was not the rank and file evangelical Christians who were involved in these cynical agreements. These were people who wanted, men who wanted their own power, felt that the power of religion in general was being eroded in America. So if they allied themselves with right-wing political activists, they could gain more power. And the right-wing political activists felt that they could tap this untapped group of people by using religious rhetoric to convince them.
Right.
And a similar thing happened between evangelicals and Catholics around the same time. Evangelical Protestants were not that anti-abortion. If you look back historically a few decades, they became so when leaders, again, of the American Protestant groups and some Catholic right-wing political activists got together and said, look, let's combine forces here. And what we need from you is to take a strong anti-abortion stance. And so they also came together. So behind the scenes, there have been these alliances and coalitions that have been built very strategically. None of this is sort of an uprising that's just happening by chance.
I see. Thank you. That's helpful. One thing I wondered about as you in the last part of your presentation, when you were talking about engaging in dialogue, and we've all, I think many of us in this meeting have had those challenging attempts to talk with a neighbor, a coworker, someone from the PTA, or someone around the Thanksgiving dinner table. Have you made some efforts in dialogue to reach out to Christian nationalists? How's it gone? Any memorable experiences that you would care to share? Any things that have worked? Encounters that left you feeling like, well, there was a human connection there that may lead to something good.
Yeah, I went to a biker rally for Mastriano as part of my research, and so I was going around and looking for folks who were wearing large Christian symbols on their person while they were there at this biker rally, and went up to them and said, "Hi, I said my name, my first name, and I said I'm doing research for a book on."
You didn't identify yourself as a priest in this context.
No,
Okay.
no. I said I'm working on a book. And I also did not use the term Christian nationalism, because that can just, that says if you now they're claiming it, but it was considered something that liberals used against them at one point. So I just said, I'm writing a book and I'm interested in Christians and patriotism, was what I said to them. And wondering what you think as a Christian about how Christianity and patriotism go together. So that was my question that I asked people. Mostly I got a friendly answer. She's like, oh, it's a no-brainer. Of course they go together. And then, some people didn't really engage much beyond that.
Mhm.
But one woman that I spoke with, about my age, so in her 60s, I would guess, we got into a pretty long conversation, and she went into some great depth about why she supported Mastriano, why, as a Christian, she thought we shouldn't be forced to take COVID vaccines. Why I don't think we talked about guns, but she went down kind of a whole list of things, and she talked about the struggle she had had in her own family with people who now had sort of split off from her and were not going to come for Thanksgiving and that sort of thing, and how painful that was to her because she couldn't talk with them anymore. And I mostly just listened and tried to understand where she was coming from. And I did feel like we made a human connection. And then she asked me for my whole name, and so I gave it. And she said, "Oh," and no, it was a good thing. My husband at that time, who's retired seminary president, was writing for the local Gettysburg Times. One of the last, our colleague Bill Moyers said, this is one of the last great dailies in America, the Gettysburg Times. And so he was doing reporting as a stringer, but he also was writing columns. And she said, "Oh," so I thought, oh, here it comes. I've been made, they say. And she said, "Your husband, I don't agree with what he writes, but he's such a good writer. I always enjoy reading his columns. You tell him that for me."
Oh, that's
And
nice.
so
Yeah.
I thought, okay, so she knew from making that connection, she knew where I came from,
Yeah.
but she didn't say, "Oh, get away from me." And we kind of left saying, isn't it nice that we were able to have this conversation together? Now, I didn't convince her of anything. I wasn't trying to convince her of anything, but maybe my little hopeful part of myself was thinking, how many positive encounters might this woman have with somebody who's not just trying to, slam her or convince her of something, but obviously disagrees with her. And it's a good encounter. How might that plant a seed towards some kind of openness in the future, that maybe we're not all, as Huckabee Sanders said the other night, we're not all crazy. So that was one example. And then I have a neighbor who I like very much, who really fits a lot of the characteristics. I've never asked her point blank, "Are you a Christian nationalist?" But I would imagine that she leans pretty much in that direction. And I live in a rural area where a majority of people do. She knows what my politics are based on my lawn signs, right? And so we're able to have a good neighborly relationship without having to get too explicit about it. So I think there's a way of building relationship that can plant seeds. Longer term, do we convince anybody? I don't know, but I hope that building relationship creates bridges where some coming together might be possible over time.
Yeah, you have to think that at least for there to be an opening is better than for there to just be a wall. So
yeah.
Even if that's all we can hope for at the moment. Ginny, have you?
I was just about to break in.
Yeah, please do.
We do have a question. I'm wondering if you might talk a little bit about why so many women are caught in this loop when which the studies showed, and then we see these weird masculine poses, and what's this all about? Could you talk a little bit about that more explicitly?
I think that it's entwined with class issues very strongly, and traditional femininity, with the wife who is subservient to the headship of the husband and that sort of thing, can be still embraced by women who otherwise do not necessarily look or act in stereotypically feminine ways. That tends to be a more middle class expression of it, because who can afford to stay home with the children? Who can afford to buy expensive cosmetics and get beautiful bouffant hairdos and all of that? That takes a certain amount of leisure and a certain amount of money. And I mean, as long as I've been an adult and noticing these things, I have noticed that working class women have never looked like that and never wanted to. And my neighbor's a great example. And she homeschooled her children until, for family reasons, couldn't anymore. She had a large vegetable garden that she tended as a kind of a subsistence garden. So she was out in the yard a lot. I think in some ways saw herself as trying to be a good Christian woman in many traditional ways. But at the same time, her life required her to also have a sort of what we might think of more stereotypically masculine toughness about her. We were lamenting that we have this groundhog that runs back and forth among our properties and does damage. And she said, well, next time you see that, you just call me and I'll be right up with my rifle. And yeah, she was dead serious. And I was like, I don't think so, but I have a little garden because I can, because I like it, right? She has a garden because, among other things, you know, she sells the eggs from her chickens. She cobbles together a living by doing a lot of different kinds of work for other people. Her garden is no joke. She needs that garden. So that is the older rural understanding of why anybody might have a gun, is for hunting and for subsistence. What's really shifting, though, is that the current gun culture is now framed in terms of security and protection, and nobody needs a military style rifle to take out a groundhog. So, but she, you know, doesn't dress in frilly dresses or lipstick or any of those things. I think when Sarah Palin came on the scene, she introduced a new kind of conservative woman, who many of these women now emulate, where there's sort of the masculine style toughness together with a certain kind of femininity. And it's sold, it became popular. There's a great book called Jesus and John Wayne by a historian, Kristen Kobes-Dumez, which I highly recommend if you're interested in sort of how the gender divide works in this whole system. It's a very good book. But these women are complicated. We shouldn't paint them with all one brush. They can't be stereotyped.
Thank you.
One of the things, yeah, go ahead, Jenny.
I was first, I want to make sure I'm switching between two screens and panels of individuals. So if there's someone who, you know, who has a question and I haven't seen you, please just say I have my hand up in the chat or something like that, so that I know that you're there and wanting to ask a question, because I'm switching back and forth. I don't see anyone else, but I also had a question about the biblical adherence. You know, if you have a group of people who say they believe wholeheartedly that the Bible is the Word of God, and yet they're reading from Old Testament straight to Revelation, I'm wondering where that disconnect came from, if you had any insight into that.
Well, there's always been a strong apocalyptic strain to all of this dominionist theology. And you see it, for example, in evangelical Christians' alliance with right-wing Israeli politics. They don't have any concern about Jews per se. In fact, in the end of days, if you're Israeli and you don't convert to believe in Jesus Christ, you're still going to hell. But they believe that the world cannot be redeemed. The second coming can't happen until the Messiah returns to the state of Israel, and that the state of Israel is an important step toward allowing the second coming to happen. So this was a big a big strand of their theology going back for decades. And there are books by a guy named Rushduni and some others. And what we are seeing in these very right-wing evangelical circles is that these dominionist ideas, which are really that extreme about we must have an explicitly Christian government in the United States, and we must live by biblical law. What you see is a trickle-down effect where other evangelicals may not have identified with that movement per se, but they read the stuff and it got into the more mainstream evangelical thinking, especially in the Southern Baptist Convention. So it's not that they don't know that the Gospels exist, it's that the most fervent preaching uses this apocalyptic language as its best fodder.
Thank you. Carla, could you take yourself off Mike's mute?
Yes, my question is, I believe you work with a seminary. How do seminaries fit into this? You said that a lot of the people who are involved in it are less educated, perhaps, but are there particular seminaries that are kind of lean towards this train of thought? Or is this something that's kind of like evolved outside of seminaries?
There are definitely seminaries that teach this. Dallas, I forget their exact name, the Dallas Theological, ouch, my cat just clawed me, stop it. The Dallas Seminary is pretty fundamentalist. Of course, Liberty University has training for ministers. They are absolutely a perfect example of the blending of white nationalism with this brand of Christianity. So yes, and I can't name them all, but there are plenty of places where you can go and get that ministerial training. Then there are mainline Christian denominational seminaries, Lutheran, Episcopal, Methodist, United Church of Christ, and so forth, where interesting. I mean, I think what happens in those seminaries is that level of education does to some degree correlate with liberalism in perspective in relation to all of this. And so people who train for ministry in those seminaries tend to get a very liberal education, and they understand, coming from the social gospel era, beginning of the 20th century, they understand that Jesus was talking about love and justice, and they read a lot of things like people like me write about these things. And then they go back into their context where a good number of their parishioners do not know this strand of theology, and there are some difficulties re-entering the world that they may have come from to train. So liberal seminaries, denominational seminaries, tend to be liberal if they're in the mainline church. And then there's places like Union where we really push the envelope, where social justice is the core of our curriculum, and interreligious engagement is also a huge piece of what we do. And so 40% of our students right now are unaffiliated, or they are in other religious traditions besides Christian, and they're intimately engaged every day with those who are preparing for Christian ministry. And it creates a completely different mindset for the students who go out from an environment like that and then minister in a Christian context, because they've engaged with people who are not Christian, and it makes a big difference in how they see the world, really. So you've got that whole spectrum of seminary, of theological education.
Thank you. Following up on the earlier question about women in this Christian nationalist group, is there an awareness that, or why do so many women support this Christian nationalism when it seems so counter to their own self-interest? Loss of reproductive rights, submission to men. Well,
the majority of evangelical women, if they really adhere to the evangelical family principles, believe that submission to male headship is the correct thing to do. It is framed, I mean, if you go on Dobson's website now, it's framed in terms of complementarianism as opposed to egalitarianism. And so they say women and men have distinct roles in the Christian community, and we need to stay in our lane. But because there's been so much critique in the last couple of decades of turning a blind eye toward domestic abuse, for example, now Dobson's materials will say there's no excuse for physical abuse or for violence because the Bible says you must love your wife and cherish her as your own body and that sort of thing. Of course, the very structure of masculine hierarchy means that many men do believe that they have the right to do whatever they want to do to keep the woman in line, and it's the woman's duty then to also do the same thing to keep the children in line. It was like God to Jesus to the man to the woman to the children.
Yeah, like you were showing on that umbrella slide.
Yeah, right. And so, I mean, if you go to church and you hear often enough that that's what it means to be godly and a good Christian and to be a good wife, then you get indoctrinated into that. It's a kind of brainwashing in a way. And there are many women who say they find it very fulfilling. So, they don't necessarily see it as being against their own best self-interest. They think that those of us who think of ourselves as liberated are actually working against our best self-interest because we haven't found that fulfillment.
Thank you. Janice, you have your hand up?
I see a hand on Janice, but you're muted.
Right, I was unmuting. I realized that probably the people I was thinking about as I came into this meeting are not really Christian nationalists, but they are probably pocketbook Republicans. So that they voted, I'm thinking about my mother's neighbor and one of my good friends' mothers who voted for Trump and will vote for Republicans. And no, they don't really want those restrictions, but we've got to somehow, keep the Republicans in because, the United States is going to go to hell in a handbasket if we don't. Are there different rules of engagement with that category of people?
Well, I don't really think so. I mean, good communication skills kind of cover it regardless of what the area of difference is. And in some ways, somebody who's not a diehard Christian nationalist might be easier for us to talk to because we're not in this, completely two different worlds that call ourselves Christian, but we mean very different things by it. I do think that there are Republicans who have always, lifelong intergenerational Republicans who inched toward the right more and more as the party inched more and more toward the right. And there's a lot of good writings out there about how that's happened. I think about my father, who worked as a manager at the General Electric company and always voted Republican. And we always were able to laugh, like, I guess our votes canceled each other out, haha, and that sort of thing. But we could talk about it. And but he would, I can't put words in his mouth. He's passed away, but I think he would have been appalled by Trump. He would have thought that, and he wouldn't have, I don't know, there are a lot of people who would say the man is disgusting, but he'll get the policies in place that we believe in. And so we're going to hold our nose and vote for him because the alternative would be much worse.
Exactly.
And there are many single issue abortion voters too, especially on the Catholic side, but many evangelical Christians too, who say, I don't care what else,
Right.
That's it for me because that's saving lives. And
Exactly. Yeah, no, I did some polling, or in North Carolina and remember a lengthy conversation with a woman who was an evangelical, and the issue she had to vote on was abortion.
Yeah,
She felt.
yeah.
Jane, let's do one more question because we're getting toward the top of the hour.
Yeah, I know. I know we've got like hands up and lots of questions all the time.
This is always what happens. Yeah, we get momentum rolling.
I'm going to go with this with the question from David about the rate of burnout in evangelical churches around issues of conflict, and whether you saw any of that in your research, evidence of that.
I don't know. That's not really my area. What I have observed in some recent studies about mega churches, and I don't know if that really addresses your question, but that mega churches are starting to avoid political conversations among members because they don't want to get into the conflict has become too heated. And so they don't necessarily have all of that political content that they might have had before, but I can't really authoritatively answer that question.
Interesting.
There does seem to be some movement away from Trump himself among evangelical, especially maybe the softer Christian nationalists, but they're moving toward people who, you know, frankly, I think are just as concerning, like the DeSantis.
Yeah, Pamela.
Is that really it? Because we have so many more people with hands up.
I know, but you know, we really try very religiously to, you know, pardon the pun, to close up shop by 9 p.m. because we
have finishing slides, right? Okay.
Yeah, well, you know, and we want to let people, you know, get move on with their lives and not take up too much, not tread on their patience. So we have a closing at 9 o'clock. We do try to stick with that. I do have one process question for you, Pamela. We follow up our meetings with an email to all of our members, all of our people on our mailing list with sources of additional information. And a couple of folks have asked whether it's possible to get access to your slides. Is that something you would be able to provide or do provide?
No, only because the way I do PowerPoint, I'm taking images off the internet, many of which are copyrighted, and it's okay to use those in an educational context, but I can't redistribute them.
Yeah, I understand. Okay, I will follow up with you though to ask for recommended articles and books and so forth, including yours, that we can include in our
and you know, in the back of my book, actually, there's a resource list. So you might just be able to pull
I'll pull some ideas from that as well. So, but however, having said all that, Pamela Cooper-White, wow, what an amazing evening. Thank you so much. I think everybody in this virtual room is grateful to you for your time, your expertise. Really appreciate everything that you shared with us. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure others did here as well. So thank you very much. Good luck. Good luck with your.
I do want to say I really enjoyed your questions. You made me think. I love that. You know I'm talking to folks who have given some thought to these things, and I really enjoyed my time with you all. And blessings on your continued work for the good.
Well, thank you so much. We do have a couple of final comments before we let people go. Thanks again to Pamela Cooper-White, who's been our wonderful guest this evening. A couple of upcoming events that I think will be of interest to everyone here. And Linda Jones, we know you kind of sneaked into the meeting a couple minutes late. I know you had some other things going on, but you're deeply involved in the 5 Towns One Book program, which is very exciting, which is going on now. Would you unmute yourself and say a little bit about this so people can know what it's about and maybe learn more?
Sure. Thanks, Carl. So I'm Linda Jones, and I'm also the co-chair of the Lorraine Hansberry Coalition of Croton. And our mission is to focus on the life and work of Lorraine Hansberry. Some of you may know that the last few years of her life, she lived in Croton, and she's actually buried in Croton. And our mission is just to uncover and amplify her life and work. This year, we had the opportunity to work with CURE, which is headquartered down in Larchmont, Mamaroneck area. And CURE stands for Coalition for Understanding Racism Through Education. And for the last 2 years, they have sponsored a series of events called 5 Towns, 1 Book. So it's the libraries of 5 towns in Westchester County, and they focus their attention on 1 book. This year, it was a book by Georgetown University professor and author Sawika Colbert. And the kickoff event was last Saturday at the Croton Library. We had a very good turnout. And Dr. Colbert was just delightful. There's no other word for her. But there are 4 other very important events that will occur in March and April. And I am going to tell you right now where you can find additional information. You can go to learnwithcure.com and you can see the full program there. But there will be attention paid to issues that Lorraine Hansberry raised in her book, in her play, A Raisin in the Sun. So there's one event on redlining. There's another event where there'll be a screening of A Raisin in the Sun with a facilitator. I think the next event, which is March 2nd, will include the actors from a play that was at the Public Theater not long ago called Baldwin and Buckley. And they will be there to talk about what it's like to be an African-American actor in this day and time. So it will culminate in New Rochelle with some student actors and other professional actors acting out excerpts from a couple of different Lorraine Hansberry plays. So it will be a fabulous series. They're all free. Registration is required just so we can manage the seating arrangements at each of the libraries. So I encourage you all to go to Learn with Cure and look up the events and attend as many of them as you can. Thank you.
Linda, thank you so much for your good work and for that beautiful explanation. One other item of interest to attendees of Repair, Alvin Hall is a good friend of Repair. He's appeared in a couple of our programs. And I just wanted to make sure you all know that his new book, Driving the Green Book, has just come out, been published by Harper One. And he's been out promoting it. If you Google his name and the title of the book, of course, you'll find plenty of places where you could buy a copy if you're interested, but there are also free events that he's been speaking at. And full disclosure, I did work with Alvin on the book. He and I are longtime friends, and we had a great time doing the book together. And those of you who know and like Alvin will love the book, I promise.
I've been waiting for this book.
Well, it's finally out. Your dreams have been answered. And of course, as always, every month we do send out our e-newsletter. If you aren't already on the mailing list, write to us at info@repairrivertowns.org and we'll put you on that distribution list. Kevin Weidinger, may I turn back to you for a closing prayer, please?
Of course. I'd like to close with one of my favorite prayers that centers me in my life in times of discord. That's the prayer attributed to Saint Francis. Let us pray. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is discord, union. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to understand, or to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
Thank you, Kevin. What a beautiful note to end the evening on. Everybody, thank you for coming. Stay safe, stay healthy. Enjoy the coming weeks as spring arrives, and watch your email for announcement about our next meeting. Thanks for coming.
Night. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Carl, do you need me to stay on for anything?
No, Pamela, again, thank you so much. I will be in touch with you, and I'll send you our list of suggested resources for other folks you can add or subtract
Sure.
anything that you'd care to. I hope you meant it when you said you enjoyed the evening. I know I did, and I
Oh,
think.
I don't lie about those things. And also, you can give them my email address in case anyone had further
Okay.
follow-up questions. I'm happy to respond.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, thank you for a good
And
evening.
good luck with
Bye.
your retirement.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll be
Bye-bye.
in touch soon. Bye-bye.